August 25, 1998, in a small apartment just outside Houston, Texas, the final hours of Louis "Buddy" Musso's life were unfolding in ways too horrific to imagine. Buddy was 59 years old, developmentally disabled, and known by everyone who loved him as gentle and trusting. Yet on that late summer night, he became the target of cruelty so extreme that investigators would later call it one of the most disturbing cases they had ever worked. At the center of it all was a woman named Suzanne Margaret Basso. To her neighbors in Jacinto City, she was just another middle-aged woman living quietly with her family. But prosecutors would later argue she was something far darker, the mastermind of a crime driven by greed and a hunger for control. They said she lured Buddy with promises of marriage, only to orchestrate days of torment that ended in his death. When police uncovered the truth, the brutality of the crime stunned even seasoned officers. And when the case reached court, the details would grip Texas headlines and draw national attention. Not only because of the savagery of Buddy's murder, but also because it led to something rare in American justice: a woman sentenced to die. This is the story of Suzanne Margaret Basso, of manipulation, exploitation, and a killing so brutal it forced the courts, the public, and eventually the execution chamber to reckon with one central question: what drives a person to orchestrate such horror? To understand how Suzanne Basso came to be at the center of such a shocking case, we have to step back decades before Buddy Musso ever entered her life. She was born Suzanne Margaret Burns on May 15, 1954, in upstate New York. Accounts of her early years suggest instability from the start. Later court records and defense arguments described her as manipulative, prone to fabricating stories, and adept at reshaping her identity to whatever role best served her. Over the years, she would use multiple names, including Sue Peak, a detail prosecutors later pointed to as evidence of her shifting persona. By adulthood, Suzanne had married, started a family, and eventually moved to Jacinto City, Texas, a working-class community just outside Houston. Her household there included her partner and her adult son, James J. D. O'Malley. Those who encountered her often described a woman with strong opinions and a dominating personality. According to testimony, she could be charming when it suited her, but equally controlling and intimidating when it didn't. Her defense team would later argue that beneath this exterior lay significant psychological issues. Evaluations reference possible delusional or personality disorders, and supporters claim she lived in a world of self-constructed stories. Whether those tendencies were the result of trauma, illness, or manipulation, they shaped the way she interacted with others. By the late 1990s, Suzanne had established herself not as a beloved neighbor, but as the commanding figure in a tight circle that included her son and several others who would later be named as co-defendants. Prosecutors would portray her as the ringleader, the one whose influence bound the group together. And when Buddy Musso came into her orbit, vulnerable and eager for companionship, Suzanne saw more than a lonely man. She saw an opportunity. Louis Charles Buddy Musso was born in 1939 and grew up in Cliffside Park, New Jersey. From the start, Buddy's life was defined by innocence and simplicity. He had developmental disabilities that made him slower than most of his peers, but those same qualities also made him deeply trusting. Family and friends remembered him as gentle, kind-hearted, and endlessly eager to make friends. In his hometown, Buddy was known as someone who would wave to neighbors from the sidewalk, offer help with small chores, and smile at nearly everyone he met. He worked simple jobs and relied on his family and community for guidance, but he was far from a burden. To those who knew him, Buddy was the embodiment of goodness, someone who loved freely and without suspicion. By the late 1990s, Buddy was living alone after the death of his mother. Though he had relatives in New Jersey who cared about him, the absence of his closest family members left him especially vulnerable. He longed for companionship, for someone to share his life with. That longing made him susceptible to manipulation. When Buddy traveled to Texas in 1997 and met Suzanne Basso, it seemed like a stroke of good fortune. She presented herself as attentive and affectionate, speaking of marriage and a shared future. For a man who had lived most of his life without a lasting romantic relationship, this attention must have felt like a dream come true. But prosecutors would later argue that Buddy's trusting nature, the very thing that endeared him to others, is what marked him as a target. Behind Suzanne's promises of love and loyalty lay something much colder, a calculated plan to exploit him. Prosecutors would later tell the jury that Suzanne Basso's relationship with Buddy Musso was never about love. It was about money. Buddy was receiving Social Security benefits, and there were suggestions of a small life insurance policy that could be collected by a surviving spouse. For Suzanne, already described as manipulative and controlling, Buddy represented more than companionship. He represented income, but she didn't act alone. Around her was a circle she dominated, her son, James J.D. O'Malley, and acquaintances who drifted in and out of her Jacinto City apartment. Bernice Aarons, Craig Aarons, Hope Aarons, and Terrence Singleton. Collectively, they were portrayed as a makeshift family bound less by loyalty than by Suzanne's influence. The plan was simple in design but horrifying in execution. By drawing Buddy into her circle with promises of affection and marriage, she gained control over his decisions and his resources. Once isolated from his New Jersey home and surrounded by her household, he was at her mercy. What followed was a descent into cruelty. Though each co-defendant played a role, the state argued Suzanne was the orchestrator, the one who encouraged and oversaw the abuse that would eventually end Buddy's life. On the night of August 25, 1998, Louis "Buddy" Musso's trust was repaid with unimaginable cruelty. Brought into the Houston area home where Suzanne and her circle lived, Buddy was cut off from the outside world. Over the next day, what should have been a place of shelter turned into a chamber of torment. Court testimony and autopsy findings revealed a sequence of abuse so prolonged and deliberate that even seasoned investigators struggled to describe it. Buddy was subjected to beatings that left bruises across his body. He was stomped on repeatedly, his bones fracturing under the weight of his attackers. There were signs of burns inflicted while he was still alive. His body bore the evidence of over 100 separate injuries, each one telling the story of suffering at the hands of people he believed were his friends. This wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was systematic. Fractured ribs, broken arms and legs, deep bruises, all consistent with prolonged torture. By the time the ordeal ended, Buddy's body was devastated. His final moments were spent not in peace or comfort, but in pain, his trust cruelly betrayed. The investigators who arrived later said the crime scene spoke of calculated brutality. This wasn't an attempt to silence a witness or cover up a mistake. It was cruelty for control, inflicted on a man who had no defenses, no strength to fight back, and no one to protect him. For prosecutors hardened by years of violent cases, Buddy's murder was remembered as one of the most horrific examples of exploitation they had ever seen. One attorney noted it wasn't just the number of injuries that shocked them. It was the way they told the story of relentless, escalating cruelty hour after hour until his life ended. Buddy Musso was 59 years old. He had left New Jersey with dreams of companionship, believing he had finally found someone who cared for him. Instead, he died in Texas, far from home, in a stranger's apartment, at the hands of people who saw him not as a person, but as an opportunity. The discovery of Buddy Musso's death quickly set law enforcement in motion. The brutality of the crime made clear this was no ordinary homicide. Police traced his final days back to the circle surrounding Suzanne Basso in Jacinto City. Within days, 6 individuals were arrested. Suzanne Basso, accused as the ringleader. Her son, James J.D. O'Malley. Bernice Aarons, along with her children, Craig and Hope. Terrence Singleton, another associate tied to the household. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of a group bound not by loyalty or love, but by Suzanne's influence and a shared willingness to exploit Buddy's vulnerability. When the cases reached court, sentences reflected the brutality of the crime and the roles each person played. James O'Malley, convicted of capital murder, sentenced to life in prison. Bernice Aarons, 80 years. Craig Aarons, Hope Aarons, and Terrence Singleton, 20 to 60 years, the result of plea deals and lesser charges. But prosecutors were clear. Without Suzanne, there would have been no crime. By 1999, the case had become one of Texas's most closely watched trials. Prosecutors presented Suzanne as the mastermind. They contrasted Buddy's vulnerability with the cruelty of his final days. Forensic experts described the staggering number of injuries. Photographs and testimony left jurors shaken. Co-defendants, seeking to protect themselves, still pointed back to Suzanne's influence. She was portrayed as the orchestrator, the one who controlled the violence. The defense argued she was mentally ill, citing possible delusional and personality disorders. They claimed the others were equally, if not more, responsible. But the jury was unmoved. After deliberations, the verdict was unanimous: guilty of capital murder. During sentencing, prosecutors argued the brutality of the crime demanded the ultimate punishment. The jury agreed. Suzanne Margaret Basso was sentenced to death. Her case made headlines nationwide, not only for the savagery of the crime, but because she joined the short list of women on America's death row. From death row, Suzanne's attorneys challenged her conviction and sentence. They argued trial errors, raised constitutional questions, and most of all, focused on her competency. They claimed she suffered from delusional thinking, manipulative fantasies, and bizarre behavior. Advocacy groups echoed the concern, warning that executing her would be cruel and unlawful. But court after court, from the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals to the Fifth Circuit to the U.S. Supreme Court, rejected the claims. Psychologists concluded she understood her situation. Whatever her mental health struggles, they did not meet the threshold to overturn her death sentence. By 2014, her appeals were exhausted. The legal system had spoken. Suzanne Basso would die. On February 5, 2014, Suzanne was led into the Huntsville death chamber. At 59 years old, she became the 14th woman executed in the U.S. since 1976. Witnesses described her as calm. When asked for final words, she gave none. At 6:26 p.m., the injection began. At 6:40 p.m., she was pronounced dead. For Buddy's family, it was the end of a long wait for justice. For critics, it was troubling. The state had executed a woman they argued was profoundly disturbed. Reactions split along familiar lines. Justice served or justice denied. The story of Suzanne Basso did not end in Huntsville. Her case is now a reference point in debates about capital punishment, mental competency, and the exploitation of vulnerable adults. It highlights the rarity of female executions in America, the power of the ringleader narrative in court, and the enduring question of whether mental illness should alter the path of justice. But beyond the legal arguments and statistics, the legacy belongs to Louis Musso, a gentle, trusting man who longed for love, and whose kindness was weaponized against him. Today, his story stands as a haunting reminder. The most dangerous predators are not always strangers in the shadows. Sometimes they are the ones who promise love and deliver only cruelty. Almost 3 decades later, the questions remain. Was justice truly served in this case, or did deeper issues, like mental health and vulnerability, go unresolved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this deep dive gripped you, be sure to subscribe, hit that bell icon so you never miss another case, and share this video with others who care about truth and justice.